Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on what we're doing as a country to boost the cultural and creative industries. When we say cultural and creative industries, we're talking about everything that falls under advertising, festivals, performing arts, visual arts, and film and art and what have you. So it's a very broad, vast particular industry. Most importantly on this show, we'll be talking about challenges and also offering solutions on how we can boost and promote talent and investment in the cultural and creative industries. My name is Dan Mpisi, I'm part of The Square. As always, and tonight is very interesting because we are back to The Square, we're back to the board with the three resident panelists of The Square, Charles, Ephraim, and Berna. Yeah. How are you this evening?
Good.
You're good?
Good.
Does this remind you of the beginning of this particular show?
Yes, it does.
Yes. No guests tonight. That's also part of The Square, where we just sit, talk, and come up with solutions on particular topics. So, as we always do, before we take a deep dive, we're going to have a highlight of the week that has been. I'll start with you, Charles.
Mine is today. So I'm driving out of the Marriott, going towards the lower part of Kiyovu, and the skies open up. The skies call the winds call Rwanda's answer to snow, and it's all hailstones. The branches are finding their way onto the cars, and hell broke loose in Nyarugenge. Now, it was very, very scary. So I got close to my destination. I pulled over by my side, and a few hours later, as I'm flipping through my phone and looking at social media reactions to that, as well as news feed on that, and I see that it has been extremely devastating in terms of trees that have fallen into the road, the heaves of water and what have you. So one particular thing came into my mind. If you look at that street that has Seashka, all the way up to the KCB on that street, it's called Plateau. And that plateau has two streets, that street and the street that has the Serenas and Marriott and BRD and what have you. Then go a little lower to Kiyovu via Bener and go down to Urban Hotel. They are very old trees that I think were planted when my grandfather was still trying to get my grandmother's attention.
Great-grandfather.
and I'm wondering, we are seated on a health hazard in Kigali City, especially that part of town. It's not the first time that it's happening. I suspect that somebody somewhere is seated extremely scared of suggesting that we cut down old trees. But they are actually a very big health hazard. The branches, I saw an extremely scary picture of an old oak tree that was probably 80 years old. If these trees do not take away people's lives, they will destroy cars. If they don't destroy cars, they will destroy our roads. So we need to get rid of all these old trees. If the mayor of Kigali City woke up tomorrow morning and said, for every old tree that we cut down, we will plant 3 new trees, we will get there, because we have trees that are probably 10 years old, and it is a tree replacing another. So before we continue losing lives and property with these old dilapidated trees, I think it's something that we need to wake up to. Yeah.
So you're saying we should cut down the trees because they actually pose a
old
hazard,
dilapidated trees, because they are
significant.
Yeah, big hazard to us, yes.
Ephraim, any highlights this week?
So I think for me the highlight of the week was, would you call that a press notice from RDB?
Press release.
Press release.
It's a press release.
Yes.
Yeah, the press release from RDB in relation to a popular, common, as they call it, multi-level marketing scheme in Kigali called World Ventures. And it was I think for me it was just very interesting to see the stance RDB has taken. And I think we'll probably talk about that as well as we get into the topic of tonight. But when you think about even the allure for RDB at the time, because these guys had World Ventures would push for the idea that when a country becomes open, it goes onto the platform and there'll be dream trips, which is in line with Rwanda's tourism agenda. But for RDB to take that stance, I would love to know more about what's going on behind the scenes. I feel like there's more to it than what meets the eye. And we'll see, like, I feel like the dust is it's still settling. Once it settles, we'll try to see like what's left of it, what's there, what's not there. Because I find it very interesting because the disciples of World Ventures are really adamant and fervent in that cause. And the disbelievers are equally as opposed to it. And
it's a polarized.
It's a polarized. So I think for me, I would want to see, now that RDB has taken the stance, and obviously some people are pushing for RIB to get involved, how that ends up at the end of the day. So for me, that was the highlight of the week. Yeah.
Okay. Brenna, your highlights of the week?
Two things. One, it was interesting to see Uncle Sam come out to dismiss the ICC, the International Criminal Court, when there's an issue that that it's targeting Americans. We know that for a very long time, Africans have raised issues about the credibility of the ICC, and for some reason, no one has taken it serious. So I'm waiting to see if Uncle Sam has spoken. Perhaps we will see either the court dismantled. That's me being too optimistic. But yeah, I think it sort of reinforces what already has been said about the selective justice that the ICC has been for a very long time. The ICC just represents selective justice and sort of international interests. Two, I went to a forum organized by Action Aid of women in agriculture. And it was interesting to listen to vulnerable women talk about their experiences in terms of agriculture. One, they feel left out in terms of the budget process and planning. Two, they are very concerned about the weather shocks because they're saying we don't know what to do. We have borrowed money for agricultural inputs. We have borrowed money for all these things. The weather comes and we don't know what to do. Is there a way government can come up with a fund, a guarantee fund to help us? And the other issue I think they tried to raise was it is good that we have women empowerment, but at the end of the day, we still have men making most of the decisions in the home, including permission to come to Kigali and attend a conference. So,
Well, yeah.
yes, so the gender experts, I think still we have a long way to do, but perhaps in terms of planning, I think gender mainstreaming has to be prioritized. So that's what the key highlights for me.
Okay, so very interesting highlights. Tonight we're discussing how to promote talent and investment in the cultural and creative industries. I would like to hear your opinions on this, and if I may just read out the first question. We know Rwanda has a very rich cultural history, when we look at our history from visual arts to performing arts to poetry and what have you. So you'd think that in 2018, this shouldn't be a nascent industry. The cultural and creative industry, based on our culture and our history, should be something that is really thriving in this day and age. And I just want to hear, in your opinion, because little has been done to tangibly and sustainably promote talent in this sector, what do you think this is the case? And what do you think actually needs to be done?
So let me. I think when you begin a conversation like this, it's very important to give context to what we're talking about. So, when we think about Rwanda's cultural and creative industry, there is also an aspect towards the ecosystem in which it operates in. And on the square, we've talked about this before. And I think this is now where I feel like we would have a very productive discussion if we address the ecosystem around it versus addressing it as is. When we talk of the noise pollution regulations in relation to the entertainment industry, which falls under the creative and cultural collective industry. For me, I feel like when you have situations where people create laws and regulation in isolation, that is probably the biggest hindrance to the industry in itself. Because one thing that anybody would tell you in the cultural and creative industry is that, one, growing up I was told culture is dynamic, that the way of life of a group of people does not remain the same forever. It is bound to change, and it is supposed to change because the times change, the environments change. Now, when you think of creativity is not, even if you may desire it to happen within a particular framework or set of guidelines and regulations, there's a certain level of freedom it requires for it to grow and be spurred on. Now, when you have situations where I gave the noise pollution regulation because that one is the closest, but there are so many regulations that are put in place that are counterintuitive and productive to this industry, and I think that's where the problem lies. Why the nascency, it seems like we take 10 steps forward and 100 back, where there seems to be progress, but at the end of the day, when you check and take stock, you realize actually we are worse off than we were a few years ago. And I think even when you think about like some of the most popular expressions of culture and creativity, so for example, Primus Guma Guma as a show. And what that did for a lot of the nascency of our industry, and how it helped a lot of these artists get that platform to advance their careers. Now, when you look at some of the issues it faced, those are things that you realize that at the end of the day, we may try to address these things and say, oh, we need to give funding, or we need to develop talent, but there are all these other things around it that are affecting it. Take, for example, football. I'll just put that for you guys to think on it. But take, for example, the football in Rwanda, our football association, and just our football. Is it an industry?
It is an industry.
Yes, our football industry. And you talk about it the most. But you have a situation where it's not the football that's the problem. It's everything around the football that is preventing the football from thriving and growing. And I think that's the same in this situation.
Yes, Brenna?
I just wanted to react to the example that you gave of Guma Guma. I mean, it's a very good example. But if you talk to some of the artists that have been part of Guma Guma, yes, Guma Guma helped one in terms of visibility because they have this countrywide tour, but for some of them, they actually feel that they're exploited. If one wins the show, for instance, you sign a contract, and there are certain rules that sort of limit. Now, using that example, I think it underlines the whole issue of building, looking at the creative sector as an industry. Because if you have a big corporate, for instance, come up with an initiative around the creative industry, they'll set the rules, so you find that the stakeholders, most likely the young people, actually don't have a voice. If it's Blarira, if it's MTN, and they're saying we are paying you 20 million, that's it. But we know behind the 20 million, probably MTN or Blarira will be making 100 million. So how do you create an environment that allows even young people to be able to negotiate their right and feel confident about that? And I think part of that is looking at the creative industry as a vital part of the economy in terms of boosting talent and innovation. Now, that cannot happen if we don't have, in my view, if we don't have whether it's a board or ministry that is dedicated to the creative industry as a big part of the economy. I'll give you another example. Today we have a lot of young people that are interested in makeup. They're very good at doing that. Who actually provides for them? Because what you have today is someone who will make a call and say, oh, you're good at makeup, come, I'll pay you 20K, and that's it. But the big question is, can this person actually survive on the 20K they come and do the makeup for? Look at DJs. They are very good at what they do, but most of them are poorly paid. And you find that the club owner makes a lot of money, but the DJ, either they don't have contracts, you know, they are working under very vulnerable terms. Look at people, I mean, the list goes on, you know. So how do we create an environment that allows talent to thrive outside the formal environment? Because if you look at the economy as it is today, it is actually set for formal skills. So if you have your degree or if you have, then you can easily fit in. But how about if I am talented and I'm just interested in makeup and actually I'm good at it? I'm interested in fashion and it's just probably something I can do even without going to school. Can we build an economy that can easily allow me the same right as someone who has gone to school?
I think there are very pertinent points being raised here. We need to be extremely deliberate about this. And I'll give practical examples. When the government of Rwanda wanted to go ICT and push ICT hard, we waived taxes on ICT and all ICT-related material. We set up RURA, we set up the Ministry of ICT. We were extrily deliberate about this.
And what have you, spaces to...
The government of Rwanda spent billions on the backbone of the fiber, and we started, you know, we'll headquarter a smart, whatever, broadband Africa, and, you know, we're extremely deliberate about this. When the government of Rwanda said, we wanted to be a model for supporting homegrown products. And we said Made in Rwanda is going to be an agenda that is going to be strongly driven. When the taxman announced the budget, they said Made in Rwanda products will not pay certain duties. When we said that we wanted to be part of the East African community and be party to East African Common Market Protocol, we were first to subscribe to that. When we said that we wanted Africans to move all over the country, we said no Africans need visa to come into Rwanda. And the list can go on and on until the cows come home. So the same thing applies with the creative industry. We need to be extremely deliberate, and I will differ a little bit with what Bana was saying in terms of a parent government body, the Ministry of Culture and Sports, that is under their purview. But I'll give you two specific areas in which I think they have fallen short. Today, if a music promoter or an events company is going to seek sponsorship for a comedy show, from whatever, MTN or Blarirwa or whoever it is, they'll get the money, but there will be a tax component on that money. If corporates knew that when they are going to support the creative industry, that particular component is not taxable, they would be able to, it would inadvertently invest, they would inadvertently put in more money into that specific sector. But I'll take it even a notch higher and say, in terms of infrastructure, isn't it extremely painful? Diana, you've been running spoken word for how many years now? That you keep trotting around looking for an ideal location, that we don't have a theater, right? We've spent billions in mini stadiums and all other kinds of sporting infrastructure, but we don't have a theater. So I want to imagine if somebody comes and says it's not a priority, then I will let go of them and say, then it's not a priority. So the point I'm raising really is that if we want the creative industry, and this even spreads. Sometimes I go to my friend Eric Kavera's place at Kwetu in Gachuriro, Kwetu Film Institute. The man has been trying to single-handedly build a cinema and a cinema school for the last 15 years. It's extremely painful. You see the pain he's going through. So we need to be very deliberate about some of these things if we are going to stretch for the industry.
If I can respond to that.
Yes.
when I talk about an institution that is in charge, I mean, if we take culture, the Ministry of Sports, and they're already overwhelmed. Now, it doesn't...
Overwhelmed with what? Exactly?
Overwhelmed
Because
with
our sports.
Right.
Apart from the cycling, I'm like, okay. And then, not that they're
There's
not
so
working.
much.
but-
Let me finish.
But I will agree with you,
Yes,
Bana,
let-
and just explain. I've been a very key stakeholder in the Ministry of Sports and Culture, and still remain.
She says
I
they're
agree
overwhelmed.
they are overwhelmed. They are
With-
indeed overwhelmed.
Let me
There are
finish.
like a million sports disciplines for lack of for
But the
being
sports disciplines
hyperbolic.
are there. But the question is, what is overwhelming the ministry?
Okay, Ephraim and
Can I
Charles, we'll
finish?
come to that. For sure. But Bernard, please finish your
Yes,
point.
I just wanted to finish. Why I insist, it doesn't have to be a ministry. It doesn't have to be a board. It can be an institute. I don't know what it is. But what I would expect it to do, one, currently the decision making around the creative industry is ad hoc. So an institution would come in, one, to actually help us understand the true value of the creative industry. That's one. Two, understanding the distribution channels, the value chain around the creative industry. When you do research like that, then you help show what the opportunities are. And that makes it easy in terms of what can you do? How do you fix a BCD?
Yeah.
If it's the minimum wage, because most of the time, people in the creative industry, like I said, are just paid, you know, depending on how someone feels. Can we look at what's the minimum you can pay a photographer, for instance? What's the minimum that you can pay a graphic designer? And these things can't just come up. You have to do research. And so that's why for me, I feel that...
Can I throw in something just to
Yes,
add to
Ephraim.
that? You know, so there is, or at least when you try to study the correlation between the nascency of the creative and cultural industries in countries and their contribution to wider economic growth, you realize that in isolation, the creative and cultural industries are not as, they don't contribute as much as we would like them to. But if you attach them to key areas of growth, they act as a catalyst. So I'll give you a simple example. Think of tourism. That's especially for Rwanda, that's a sector for high growth. When you add a component of the cultural and creative industry to it, it acts as a catalyst for that overall sector. The same thing with ICT, and it's coming back to what you're saying about prioritization. I don't think in isolation we can prioritize the cultural and creative industry. When it comes to the value chain, and if we understood the value chain, you'll understand that if we actually understood these things to be a part of everything else, we would actually start to see much more value coming from those sectors than we currently see, because we try to develop it in isolation, and that's where we miss it. Yeah.
And also to add to what you're saying, I know government is doing a mapping report that's been in the pipeline for quite a while, but I'm hoping that the finalization of it will be soon.
What are
but
they
it's
mapping?
kind of, they're mapping the cultural and creative industry. So looking at how many artists we have, the businesses, the value chain, the involvement, all the way from the beginning to the end of the involvement of
And which
businesses.
government
in this.
entity is doing this?
I know the Ministry of Sports and Culture is doing it with other agencies. I don't know if you know Isho Arts Center in partnership with UNESCO as well. Also involved, I think, is the Rwanda Association for Languages and Culture, RANC. There's so many, there are different institutions working towards this creative and cultural industries, but I agree with what you're saying, Brenna, in the sense that I feel like there's a sense of, it's a bit ad hoc. I'm not sure if there's duplication of responsibilities. And what happens is that, to a certain degree, it fails to move forward at a faster pace than it is moving. But that said, as someone who's involved in this particular sector for the last 7 years with Spoken Word Rwanda, I'll have to, hats off to the fact that there's growth. 7 years ago, literally speaking, if you wanted to go and watch a play, it was next to impossible. If you wanted to go and watch comedy, it was next to impossible.
Is it because the industry is developing, or is it the audience is appreciating it?
I think what happened, a lot of people pioneered this particular industries. So people, creatively just went ahead, not through formal, and these are not formal entities, so to speak, and started this. You have comedy nights, you have the people who do the fashion week, you have the festivals, Kigali Up festivals, you have spoken word, you have all these activities that are happening. And, you know, kudos to the people who are doing this. But it's an industry whereby support is it's lacking.
Yeah.
And your point also about hyperregulation, it's something that I think we need to work in tandem. You know, people in the private sector who are in this industry, the governing bodies who are in charge of this, whether it's RDB, whether it's, you know, the Ministry of Sports and Culture. I know for a fact there's some conversations that have been happening over the years, but
can I ask a question?
Yes.
And I think this is for everyone on the panel. You know, do you get the sense that we know what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah.
With the industry, do we? Do you feel like we have a sense for, the end game is X, and we can visualize it, or are we just like, it's important to invest in the cultural and creative industry, but we don't know to what extent it can actually benefit or our country, or if we don't have it, do a disservice to it? And that for me is the question: do you guys believe that we have the end in mind when we do this stuff?
If you ask me, I'll say no, and I could point out, for instance, if a photographer went to a commercial bank and said, I need 100 million for my photography project, how many commercial banks would actually give this photographer money?
If you ask a lot,
I'll actually take it a notch higher. I'm an ardent follower of comedy nights. And I actually go to maybe...
And Kigali Jazz Junction.
Yes, and Kigali Jazz Junction. I'll come to Kigali Jazz Junction because I think there's something they're getting right. But let me start with comedy nights. And Arthur is my friend, and I religiously attend the comedy shows. I don't like that they've only one small factor that they've moved most of their shows to Sundays. And the guy will tell you it's because that's where venues are available and cheaper. But it pains me that easily, when you look at the audience, 70% of them, roughly 70% of them, will relate with the jokes and the stories that are being told by the local comedians. But you find that generally speaking, he will be struggling to sponsor that show or to get sponsorship for that show until he brings on a regional and international big shot. One, he'll most likely get sponsorship from one or two corporates. But this is the sad news, that even the number of people who relate with that sort of big boys jokes will not change. Because the majority of the people are going to relate with Babu's and Arthur's and Hervé's and all these other people's jokes. So we need to believe and trust in our product because we have a very good product. And probably that is where Banner's point comes in around that institution that is responsible for these people. That in the absence, as we are seeing them grow, who is going to help them grow? And brings me to my next point around Kigali Jazz Junction. Unless I'm not in the country, I'll never miss a Kigali Jazz Junction.
You're a socialite, so it's okay.
Kigali Jazz Junction. You're not spoiled for choice, and I like that. Diana is always around the vicinity. But Kigali Jazz Junction has gotten one thing right, that they will always get that one local artist. And all the time, it will be almost like for like. I like to give an example of a guy called Andy Bumono. I think that's his name, Andy Bumono. I had never heard of that guy.
He's very talented.
Until I got to Kigali Jazz Junction. Amazing talent. He kept us on our feet throughout the whole show. I thought Masamba was a guy who's entertaining Gakondo and entertaining at Gusava's and you go to Milcolin and 20, 30 minutes and you're fed up. I went to Kigali Jazz Junction with a group of elderly cricketers from the East African region who did not understand Kinyarwanda. Masamba kept them on their feet for 1 hour and 15 minutes. So that just shows you one thing. Give a Rwandan artist
the opportunity.
One chance and he'll grab it with both hands.
And Charles, also to add to that, I'd like to touch upon in the same thing of trusting our product. I totally agree with you. It also applies to other sort of activities. And I'll give an example for, these big conferences that we have. We're positioning ourselves as a meetings, incentives, conferences, and events and exhibitions hub. But you have, these huge conferences with thousands of delegates coming in. And most times I find it really interesting to see that the facilitators or the moderators are often not Rwandan. And this is not to say Rwanda is lacking in this particular talent, in this particular professional services. Most times these conferences will bring in someone else. And it's not to say that we can't negotiate and actually say, look, we have our people. But in the event that you do have Rwandans there, when you look at the remuneration, the payment packages, if a Rwandan tries to ask for the same amount of money, for let's say if you're comparing yourself with an example is Julie Gishuru, brilliant woman, brilliant facilitator. But there's such people like that in Rwanda. And I don't know why for some reason, and it goes back to what you're saying, I don't know if it's because you don't believe in our products, but it's difficult to actually get the same sort of packaging.
Interestingly enough, sort of I'm just going to say in relation to that, because it's not just in that.
It
cuts across, yes. And now when you now start to talk about culture in relation to the cultural and creative industry, we have, and I'm not going to talk at length about it, but in Rwanda we have very self-defeating ways or habits when it comes to advancing our own people and allowing opportunities for our own people. But when you think about coming back to this whole idea of Rwandans having the capacity to actually play on the international scale, I was telling somebody the other day, I'm like, no one understands what Wizkid is saying. No one understands what Olomide is saying. No one understands what Burna Boy is saying. But we blast our music like there is no tomorrow. And that comes down to when she talked of value chains. How our music transcends our borders is very important because of how we actually understand the business of the creative industry.
And as Charles said, deliberately
creating
channels to promote this talent.
Exactly. And I think when you start to look at when you now start to go beyond that, now when you start to think about art. Now, personally, I'm a huge art fan. I collect art, I find artists, like I go to Expo to find artists.
Do you buy local art?
I need to learn about art.
And
seriously, and actually I've sold some paintings at a profit. So it's actually a profitable investment for me. But I love art. Now, we're building spaces. In some of the offices, the buildings that Charlie manages. And one of the things that actually I bumped into a local artist the other day and asked him how are things. He's like, man, things are tough. I'm like, why don't you have some paintings lying around? He's like, sure. I'm like, why don't you bring them? We put them on our walls because we have new spaces. We put your name at the bottom. We add our markup. And our tenants, who are mostly international companies and organizations, the people walk through, they see the art, and they buy. Now, that is coming down to now when you now start to talk about the value chain. People, even for an artist to think beyond that, the belief is I paint and I have to take it to an art gallery. And obviously people face challenges around that. But there are many other ways in the value chain in relation to the creative and cultural industry where we can actually maximize that return on investment. Yeah.
Brennan,
I wanted to react to that. When you mentioned that foreigners are most likely to buy the art, for me that's an issue. And I'll tell you why it's an issue. As long as we have products that just foreigners can afford to buy.
It's not even about afford. It's about desire to buy.
It's not just desire. It's a cost. If you go to many Rwandan homes, you wouldn't really find ordinary homes. I'm talking about not
the ordinary home,
not your kind of home. You know, you don't easily find art, and not because people don't appreciate it, but for most people they can afford it. They can't afford it. That's one. Why can't they afford it? Or let's even talk about Rwandan-made pieces.
I disagree.
Let me finish. Let me finish. Or let's look at beautifully done Rwandan products. Most of the time, they are actually quite expensive for ordinary Rwandans. And you know why? Because the cost of production, for most of them, it's very high. We're going back to the value chain. That's one. Two, the cost of how much they have to go through to actually produce the different pieces, it's too high. Yet, if you look at the demand, you'll have, if a foreigner comes in and they have $500, that's it.
But
You tell
yeah,
me how many Rwandans.
I disagree. Now,
Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. On average, a beautiful art piece, how much does it go for?
so you're saying on average. Let me tell you.
Please
let
tell
me tell
me,
me.
how much on average? On
Okay.
average.
Now, okay.
How many dollars?
Let me explain.
I think he's
I have a
gonna answer your
piece.
question.
I have a.
How
She's like,
many?
I want an answer.
but
No, but look, wait.
I want an answer.
The
But
most
we need to go
affordable.
for the break,
Yes,
so
the most
quickly.
affordable painting I have costed me 15,000 francs. There was a time actually when I bought like about 20 pieces. Combined, I paid not more than 300K.
Okay.
Now-
so for you, 15,000 is actually cheap.
No, it's not cheap.
But
I'm
let's-
trying to say that it's
affordable.
affordable.
It's
for
affordable.
the. It's affordable.
I didn't know there were art pieces that cost 15,000.
I don't know
francs.
about that.
Most guys
That's
want to buy
for argument's
$200.
sake.
What?
And that's for argument's sake.
But Brendan, it's affordable to the consumer. Most people who consume this, their purchasing power is not the ordinary.
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
but you
Rwandans.
see, but
So
you
let's-
see,
let's-
no, but
let's
I want to move. I want to
contextualize.
move. I want to move away
Let's
from art
contextualize
pieces
it.
because there are also other. I mean, paintings.
Yeah.
There are also other forms of art.
Yeah.
Now let's take for example the Agaseche basket.
Yes.
You can go to these places, even the places where you think are purely for tourists. You can find a Agaseche. You can get something for even as little as even these ladies in
You
Wang.
see,
You can even get it for
that's-
1,500
Even
francs.
that, even
Brenda,
that.
can you
Let me
wind up
explain
before
why
we
it's
go
a
to the
problem.
break?
Yes.
Yes.
Even that, if you can go somewhere and get it much cheaper, it's a problem because for this vulnerable person who is selling it to you at 15,000, it doesn't make business sense.
True.
So why we need, sort of an environment that allows fair play.
But my question is,
Whether
you're
you buy it from
contradicting yourself
Kigali,
because
whether you buy it from Kigali or you buy it from somewhere in Musanze, it should be the
but,
same.
but, you're con-
Okay,
but
it
you,
should
you
be
will come back
competitive.
after the break.
No,
but
we'll come back after the break and flesh this out. Your points between Brenna and Ephraim. So we'll be back after the break. We're here discussing how to promote talent and investment in the cultural and creative industry. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us once again. We're here talking on the square about boosting talent and investment in the creative and cultural industries. My next question to the panel is to do with entertainment tourism.
Yeah.
And by this, I mean deliberate efforts to have entertainment activities that bring in people from the region. So I'm talking large-scale festivals and what have you. When we position ourselves as a MICE hub, when it comes to this entertainment tourism, for some reason, the reasons we've just been talking about, we fall short in this, or we don't do as much as we should be doing. And my question to you, I want to know, is this a result of lack of innovation from players in the private sector? Or is it to do with the fact, not the fact, but is it to do with what you said earlier on hyper-regulation of decision-making bodies that are in charge of this particular sector?
If I may,
Charles.
I want to relate that entertainment tourism with Mai's point we were raising earlier on.
Yes.
Because if we're going to bring this horde of guests to come into our country, we need to make sure they're entertained, they go to nice places, and so on and so forth. But I think between Diana and Bana, you did raise a point that we left hanging earlier before we went to the break around our events and conferences and how we ensure that we Rwandanize them as much as possible. Now, for the last 2 days, I've been at a large World Bank group event that was hosted, facilitated, and I looked at everybody along the chain, the value chain. I was impressed that there was a Rwandan transport company that was supplying it, but I became a bit nosy. I asked, who's doing the sound?
Rwanda.
Who is doing the, no.
Oh.
Foreign company. Who's doing the audio visual? And a lot of it was foreign. The facilitators, the moderators, and then I asked myself, okay, hang on a second. Are we at least getting 15% withholding tax from all these foreign companies that are coming to Rwanda to make money? Most likely not. Hey, fine, I think we are losing a point. And two things come into my mind. One is I have a relationship, a business relationship with an international, a South African-based property events company. And they did point out to me something that made a lot of sense, that we are not yet there in as far as capacity is concerned when it comes to hosting and organizing international events. That almost all of our events company, and this is something the guys at Rwanda Convention Bureau concur with, that literally all our events companies are logistics companies. When you put them to the task and say, can you do the A to Z, prepare the content, do the speaker briefs, identify the resources who are actually going to speak, do the entire thing, they're most likely not going to be able to. But tell them to organize the event, bring stands, screens, and all that stuff. Hang on a second. I am going to come. Yes.
Heavily defer.
So the point that, well, they told me, again, as I said, that was their opinion. So yes. It's their opinion. The point they told me was that we are not yet at that level. But I will relate with it to a certain extent because I have engaged some of the big players in the market, and they are comfortable to play in the logistics space. My personal interpretation is because that side of the bread is also buttered. Now take it a notch higher and say, to what extent is the Radisson Blues of this world and the Hilton groups and all Carlson Rediza and what have you going to attend an event that is organized by Diana and Sons Limited compared to bench events or Marcus Evans or, some of these global brands? So people will deliberately invest in their brands, and wherever they will go, people will follow that brand. So let's acknowledge that that's how things are, that the international events that we manage to bring to Rwanda might come with certain conditions, with those international brands. But the ones that are ours, and that is really where the point should be, that if it's going to be a FESPAD, if it's going to be a Quitizina, if it's going to be, all these events that are ours, if it's going to be an AU summit, if it's going to be all this XYZ, let it be as Rwandanized as possible.
So for me, we're talking about talent and development in this space. Now, I feel like we are heavy on the nationalistic rhetoric, which I would want us to step back from and say, okay, what normally happens in any industry, if let's say you're going to set up a coffee industry, it's in your best interest if you're going to buy machines, for example, from Turkey. A Turkey technician is going to come for a particular period of time, train your staff, and then you have the capacity internally to carry out yourself. Now, the reason I'm saying that we have to be very cautious about how much we push this Rwandanized rhetoric is because we might miss an opportunity to learn from internationally. And this is what you're saying about these brands coming in and guys are like, well, okay, handling the logistics. But obviously there has to be that point where a Rwandan company is given the job, but they have to provide. So in some tenders, in some of the work that we do, what they ask you to do is that you can be the project promoter and you can be the project manager. But they ask you to list your suppliers and vendors so that it also adds the value to your project. And if you're genuinely working with these people, they don't circumvent you because everybody knows what they're doing. And that is something that we could use to structure how we go about making sure that it's made in Rwanda. We can get Rwandans to be the project leads. And you tell them, at least for X, Y, and Z, get a foreign, or get somebody who has credibility. And they are taught how to do so in such a manner that at least there's some transfer. And I think we did it in the construction sector when it came down to the Chinese and the construction. Chinese wanted to bring the workers and we're like, we have labor, don't bring your people. And they're like, okay, we'll still manage, just allow us to supervise.
So to come back to my point that I said earlier, is it a matter of, and you more or less answered it, is it, just lack of innovation and an entrepreneurial spirit with members of the Rwandan private sector, or is it a matter of conditions that don't allow them to thrive? I want to hear your thoughts on that. Why is it that these particular industries remain where they are when it comes to that? Brenna, you had something earlier on that you wanted to say. I hope it's in relation to this.
Yeah, no, just to emphasize that, one, we have to allow our people the time to grow.
Yes.
I mean, no one wakes up and they are walking.
That's true.
And that cannot happen if people don't have opportunities. So if we can have an ecosystem that encourages partnerships, ensuring that for every international event we have a local partner, that will help us grow. But if you just sideline, local talent and say this is high level, it has to be,
It will
a
stay
team,
there.
then how will we grow?
But in that vein, I'd like to appreciate some efforts. I think you guys heard of the what is it called? Rwanda Ubuhanzi. It's a joint effort between the Ministry of Sports and Culture, Imbuto Foundation, Talent-Wide Search, the first of its kind in the country. So I think it's very timely that this is happening. And
But another question I'd ask, coming back to the question I asked before, what's the end game? Because the issue is you identify the talent, then what? Do you have an investment in those young people? What's the plan to take the art beyond Rwanda? What's the plan to grow that capacity so that the art becomes world class, so that they can compete? That's what I keep asking. Like some of these initiatives, it's well and good, and I really think it's a good initiative. But then the question I ask, maybe you guys may know it, but I do not.
I want to give an example of myself.
But can you just finish quickly?
Yes. Just to respond to that, until we go back to the issue of knowing the true value, creating value chains, then you cannot build a viable business, around the creative industry. So I think what remains a priority is one, to map out, do concrete studies to give us the true value of the creative industry.
Which is what's happening.
Yes, because then a photographer could go to a bank and say, look, according to this research, this is the potential, and this is the projection. And then perhaps the bank can look at the project and think it's viable. In the absence of data or anything, then there's no point, because they'll just say, oh, your camera is probably just a couple of dollars.
But you're very spot on in terms of in absence of data. Charles, before we get to the social media.
Yeah, just before you go there, I wanted to give you an example of myself on two different occasions. One involving the same institution. This institution comes and asks me to moderate a 2-day workshop on one occasion. A year later, they come up to ask me to host a dinner, all high profile. And I tell them, okay, fine, that's a bit within my range and comfort zone. My rates are this. The permanent secretary in that ministry was shocked that I asked for
the audacity.
I had the audacity to ask for money, a portion of which 15% was going to go to Rwanda Revenue Authority. And they were in shock. Fast forward, probably around the same time, again, two government institutions meet somewhere, and it's a very, very high profile event that involved external people, and they said, no, we don't want somebody from out of Rwanda to come and handle this event. Do you have somebody? That institution put my name there, and I put in my fee note. And the two American ladies who are involved in that event were, okay, fine, this is very fair. And on the sidelines of it, a very senior government official asks me, but how can you embarrass us to this extent? And,
so it's the value. It's the value that I think we need to start attaching to these.
But I think I don't even think it's about the professions, because, and this is why I'll talk about culture and some of the things we need to overcome as Rwandans. If he was a regional, international individual in the same line of work, he dropped his rates card, even the Rwandan wouldn't have said anything.
No. Remove the if. I actually dropped it, because when I go to do the same in Nairobi or in Johannesburg, it's double that amount. So
let's just quickly go and see what people on social media are saying about this particular show. And our first tweet is from Gloria Karenjera, who says that for the cultural and creative industry to grow, the players must exercise discipline. This industry requires being grounded and constantly reinventing oneself. Sadly, most players struggle with this. This is a very, very valid point. This whole time we've been talking about the ecosystem and providing them, with structures, people involved, but looking at the players themselves, I think that's something that we also need to
upping the game, upping the game, and patience, investing in themselves.
Yes.
Gloria's tweet reminds me of a group called Mashirika. You
Yes.
see where they came from and where they are today. They've had faith in themselves. Hope Azeda and her group have significantly invested and have been patient in themselves and what have you. There's a particular artist, I think the guy's name is Kaitare Waitare. I found the guy, he was an amazing singer, a great singer in I think early 2000s. I found him, he was a tailor somewhere in town. I almost dropped a tear until he told me how much money he was making. Then I consoled myself. But like, you know, Rwanda has lost a talent. And the guy told me when we had just begun singing, things were not good. It's only now that people are beginning to be recognized.
Yes.
So I think the point is really around the patience and persistence,
and discipline,
discipline,
and reinventing oneself. It's not an easy industry, absolutely. So we are coming to the end of our show and discussing how to promote talent and investments in the cultural and creative industry. Please continue giving us your feedback on social media, especially on Twitter with the Square, hashtag the Square RW. Ephraim, Bernard, Charles, closing remarks, very quick, short closing remarks on this particular industry.
So I'll make it very short. I just want to talk about what we talked about before the break in relation to what Berna said. She said something when we were off air about, you know, how people will talk about food. They'll go to the rural areas and say, but food is cheaper in the village and it's good for you, but is it good for the person in the village? And I just wanted to refute that with very simple economics. And this is not me speaking as a capitalist or with my privilege, but it's the truth. The cost of living is cheaper there. That's why up country some of these things are cheaper. So you can find art outside of the city at a cheaper rate for Rwandans who cannot afford the rates that foreigners pay in the city.
But
and that's my logic.
Ephraim, you've cheated.
Squeezing them.
You've cheated. I wanted you to give closing remarks.
That was my closing remarks.
Don't
I'm done.
Ephraim.
I
need closing remarks from you.
I will not respond to.
Please don't.
I will not respond to him, but just to emphasize gender mainstreaming in this whole industry. We really need gender mainstreaming right at the beginning, not in the middle, and not as ad hoc. Because now we're already seeing initiatives like the one you just mentioned at
Ubuhanzi.
Ubuhanzi,
Arts
yeah.
under Ubuhanzi.
Yes. We need concrete interventions, gender mainstreaming, when we roll out these programs, not 5 years later. There are less women.
Yes.
Yeah.
Charles, very quick
Earlier
closing
today,
remarks.
earlier in the show, I mentioned that I was at the World Bank Group conference. One of the World Bank chiefs, at the end of the conference, one of the World Bank chiefs noted that our Minister of Finance and Economic Planning was in the audience and recognized his presence. And he gave his remarks, points towards the end. The moderator, because of not being aware of who he is and being foreign, referred to him as the gentleman over there.
Oh my goodness.
So it goes back to your point of trusting.
Let us
Yes.
Rwandanize and encourage whatever we have available. We have quality, and it's up to us to be extremely deliberate. And by us, I mean whatever institution that there is. We have to be extremely deliberate about promoting our own creative industry. Yes.
Thank you very much. As always, it's been a very dynamic conversation. I hope people have been following on social media and behind your screens. Thank you for joining us. And I think this is a conversation we'll most likely have again. It keeps on evolving, it keeps on changing. But I'm glad we had it here. Very important. Promoting talent and investment in the creative and cultural industry in Rwanda. We have the talent in Rwanda. We have these talented people in these fields, but we just need to deliberately, I think that's the main takeaway, invest in these people, in these players, and especially in the value chains. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening and see you next Wednesday.